Rugby League has seemingly always faced three key problems. 1. Expanding the game outside of the traditional M62 corridor. 2. Deciding how their league competitions will be structured. And 3. Bringing more money and investment into the sport outside of its traditional roots. All three of these key problems provide a little subsection of problems, but importantly, they are all tied to one specific fact that just cannot be changed. The fact that Rugby League was born from a split between the northern clubs from the Rugby Union in 1895. There have been hundreds of votes, meetings, recommendations, expansions, and changes to the sport, all to try and fix these key problems, but they still prevail. There's also been three major attempts to fix these problems all in one, and the most recent is the Reimagining Rugby League recommendations released by IMG on September the 28th, 2022. The question is, though, are these recommendations actually reimagining rugby league? In April 1995, the member clubs of the Rugby Football League voted to accept an £87 million investment from Rupert Murdoch's B-Sky B. In doing so, they agreed to the creation of a Super League and the restructuring of the league itself. London Broncos and a new Paris franchise would now have a place in the new 12-team Super League, but traditional clubs Featherstone Rovers, Salford, Wakefield Trinity and Widnes would all be demoted to the new subservient First Division. Hull and Doncaster were also relegated from the division, and the current champions of the second tier Keighley Cougars and second place Batley would not be promoted as agreed at the start of the season. All of the RFL member clubs voted in favour of this decision, aside from Widnes, who voted against it, and Keighley Cougars, who abstained. The vote had been described in later years by the club representatives who were there and took part in the vote as a gun to the head, with the offer of £87 million appearing too good an offer to turn down. And at the time, Rugby League was in a crisis. Some would say that it's always been in a crisis, ever since the split from Rugby Union in 1895. It had been born out of controversy, but it was also born out of equality and fairness, with the northern clubs splitting because they wished to be able to pay their working class players, which would basically allow them to actually keep playing the sport, which the southern clubs had demanded remain amateur. The 1970s saw the first suggestions of discontent from the big clubs of the time, as the 15% levy of gate takings that all First Division clubs paid, and was shared equally amongst all the clubs at the end of the season, became a bone of contention. In 1986, the first suggestions of a Super League were made by Wigan chairman Jack Robinson. He said it would be a way to increase television and sponsorship money, but eventually it came to nothing, but the levy was reduced to 8%. A Super League was also mooted by a cartel of clubs called the Top 16 in 1992, who again felt that the more successful clubs deserved a bigger slice of the pie. And once again, they wanted a smaller levy to pay back into the game. The push for more control, more money by the bigger clubs in the game also coincided with the replacement of David Oxley as chief executive with a man called Maurice Lindsay. Maurice Lindsay had transformed Wigan into the most dominant side in rugby league history. He was a revolutionary, and he'd built Wigan into a club that would win the First Division 7 times in a row. They'd also win the Challenge Cup 8 times in a row, and absolutely dominated the sport in the late 80s into the mid-90s. Lindsay's Wigan were the only fully professional side in rugby. They had a wage bill much higher than any of their competitors and were spending significantly more on transfer fees, but they were a fantastic side. Lindsay had a vision of what he felt would solve the issues that rugby league had traditionally faced, and he envisioned a game played across Europe's biggest cities in world-class stadiums in front of 25,000 plus crowds. Lindsay also agreed with the top 16 on one important point, that the smaller, lower division clubs were dragging the game down. Lindsay was the architect of what became Super League in 1995, and he was convinced that his vision would revolutionise the sport of rugby league. The RFL member clubs had agreed in principle in 1994 to create the Rugby Premier League, which would include the current First Division sides with the promotion and relegation from that season honoured. Part of the plan for a new Premier League came off the back of a document called Framing the Future. This was an in-depth look into the finances, marketing and presentation of the sport by marketing company GSM. The project had been strongly advocated for by Keighley Cougars director Mike Smith, and it was commissioned by the RFL. Framing the Future had recommended a number of areas of the game that required attention. Notably, there was marketing, branding, grounds, facilities and the overall finances of the clubs. After Framing the Future, the RFL announced plans for the new Premier League. These were agreed and the RFL began working with the clubs that would eventually become part of it. The clubs included Keighley and Batley of the Second Division, and the RFL went to the clubs to discuss how they could all work towards improving themselves in the areas identified by GSM. But then the Premier League never happened. Lindsay presented the clubs with a huge sum of money that was on offer from Rupert Murdoch's News Corporation, and the plan for the Premier League ended up in the bin, as the clubs voted in the Rupert Murdoch-backed Super League. The Super League plan meant a switch in the calendar from winter to summer, an alignment with the Australian Rugby League calendar and a lucrative end-of-season World Club competition. And also for the first time, the exclusion of clubs from taking part in the new top division of the game. Keighley, Widnes and Batley were told that they would not form part of the new Super League as they did not meet the criteria. And just to stress, this criteria did not exist at the time. They were replaced by clubs like Paris and London. Paris did not last long and after 2 seasons they folded. Most of the Super League clubs were also almost bankrupt and the popularity of the game had not increased to the levels that Maurice Lindsay had imagined. The international calendar had also been decimated as Lindsay had picked the side of Murdoch over the Australian Rugby League governing body in the ongoing Australian Super League war. The extremely popular and lucrative test matches between Great Britain and Australia were now a thing of the past, and once they returned, they were never as strong as they had been previously. The recommendations made in Framing the Future were added and amended to by the RFL and formed into a set of criteria. This set of criteria became known as Framing the Future 2. This document outlined the criteria required for a club to play in the Super League. So previously, when they were telling clubs like Keighley, Widnes and Batley that they did not meet the criteria and could not show them any signed and agreed criteria, that problem was now solved. But the criteria included things such as a 10,000 capacity ground, which many of the Super League clubs themselves did not meet. At the RFL, tensions between the chairman Rodney Walker and chief executive Maurice Lindsay had reached boiling point, after Lindsay had tried to remove Walker in a coup. Walker had managed to force out Lindsay, but he could not calm the growing discontent amongst Super League clubs. Once again, the top clubs felt that they were being held back by the clubs in the lower divisions, and they also felt that they were being hamstrung by the RFL in their negotiating position for TV and sponsorship opportunities. So they decided it was time to break out on their own. The RFL had been the sole governing body of the game until the formation of Super League Europe in 1997. The formation of Super League Europe was primarily an exercise by the clubs in the Super League to wrestle the power away from the RFL, and to prove a point, they appointed a familiar face as their chief executive, Maurice Lindsay. Lindsay would remain with Super League Europe until 1999, and the two governing bodies did eventually realign. But the promises of Super League did not really come to fruition, as expansion teams such as Paris and Gateshead failed to take off, and established clubs such as Sheffield and Halifax ended up in administration. There was no rugby league being played in the major European cities as Lindsay had imagined, and the new world-class stadiums and facilities had not been built either. What had happened was that most of the money had been spent on players' wages, and the old problems of the past were still present. Super League had an open door at its inception, with promotion to the league being possible as long as you met the criteria of framing the future too, which, unlike the criteria in 1995, had actually been published and agreed on by all the clubs. Salford, Huddersfield, Hull and Wakefield were all promoted to the Super League between 1996 and 1998. But then in 1999, Hunslet won the league and were denied promotion. The year after, Dewsbury won the league and they faced the same fate, also being denied promotion to the Super League. Promotion and relegation continued as normal from 2001 until 2006. In 2006, new franchise Catalan Dragon finished bottom of the Super League. So the team that finished in a place above them, Castleford Tigers, were relegated in their place. This was the first occurrence of any such happening in Rugby League, where a team finishing bottom of the division was not relegated to the one below, but instead a team finishing above them was relegated in their place. But this wasn't the only change in Rugby League, as in 2005 there had been an announcement about a new licensing proposal for the structure of the sport. Automatic promotion and relegation would be replaced with a new licensing system. New teams in Super League would be admitted there via a 3-year licence, which would commence in 2009. Clubs would once again need to meet certain criteria in order to play in the Super League. The 3-year licences would protect clubs against any relegation and lock in participating clubs for 3 years, when the next round of licences would start. Licences were put into 3 categories: A, B and C. During the licensing period, a number of clubs who won the second tier championship missed out on that lucrative promotion that had been taken away. Barrow in 2009, Halifax in 2010, Featherstone in 2011, Sheffield in 2012 and 13 and Leigh in 2014. Halifax were also actually awarded a Super League licence in 2011, but they were not promoted due to a space not being available. However, the RFL said it was because the application was not up to the standard of the other Super League teams. There was controversy at the time, as Wakefield Trinity had been deemed not to have met the criteria for their licence application, but yet they still remained in Super League. The one space that was available, due to the withdrawal of the expansion side Celtic Crusaders, went to Widnes. Widnes were promoted despite not winning the championship competition since their relegation from Super League in 2005, and actually finished 5th in the table the year they were promoted. Licensing was eventually abandoned in 2013 when it was determined that it simply had not served its purpose. The criticisms aimed at the RFL were that only one team had been elevated to Super League during that period, and the promised new grounds and facilities had not been built. But the main issue was that teams had not met the licensing criteria and also not been expelled from Super League. And whilst clubs were not expelled from Super League for not meeting the licence criteria, clubs were prevented from joining Super League for not meeting the licensing criteria. Featherstone, Leigh and Barrow all applied for a licence and were told they could not join, whereas Halifax, of course, applied for a licence, received it, but then were told that there was not a space available. At the end of licensing, promotion and relegation returned, but with a twist in 2015, as the traditional 1 up, 1 down, 2 up, 2 down, 3 up, 3 down system was replaced by something called the Super 8s. This was where the top 4 teams from the Championship played against the bottom 4 teams from the Super League. The teams that finished this mini-league in 1st, 2nd and 3rd would gain a place in the Super League, whilst the teams in 4th and 5th would play off in something called the £1 million game for the final Super League place. This system continued until a shock announcement. On September the 14th, 2018, Super League clubs once again voted to split from the RFL and form their own governing body. Once again, the main concerns were over TV deals and sponsorship money, with Robert Elston being appointed the chief executive. The Super 8s were now canned, and the promotion to Super League was back to 1 up, 1 down. In the 4 years of Super 8s, only Leigh in 2016, Hull KR in 2017 and London Broncos in 2018 managed to gain promotion to Super League. But 2 of those teams were also 2 of the 3 teams that were relegated from Super League in that period, as Hull KR and Leigh were both relegated after being promoted, and Widnes were also relegated from Super League. The one-up, one-down system remained in place, with new expansion side Toronto Wolfpack gaining promotion in 2019, only to be kicked out by their fellow clubs a year later after initially withdrawing from the Super League due to the impacts of COVID-19. COVID-19 also resulted in a shorter 2020 season, and Leigh were chosen to be promoted up to Super League in place of the now folded Toronto Wolfpack. Leigh were relegated again in 2021 and replaced by Toulouse Olympique, with the 2 clubs recently swapping places again, as Toulouse were relegated in 2022 and Leigh have been promoted back to Super League. Robert Elston remained as CEO of Super League until February 2021, when he resigned his position. Reports stated that his resignation had cited a failure to negotiate a better TV deal and increase investment in the sport. Elston had also been criticised for his failure to support Toronto in their application to be readmitted to Super League, and also his actions in forcing a split from the RFL in 2018. Leeds chief executive Gary Hetherington had said at the time of the split that it was an absurd grab for power for the game by a small group of men who think that they own the game. And this all brings us to May 2022. The departure of Elston from Super League and the huge reduction in television income from the Sky TV left the RFL and Super League both looking for a way to improve the game. On the 10th of May 2022, Super League and the RFL announced a 12-year deal with American group IMG to maximise the sport's growth. IMG is a global sports, events and talent management company which is a subsidiary of Endeavour Group Holdings. Endeavour Group Holdings is the company that represents the NFL, the NHL and owns the UFC and Miss Universe, not the person, the competition. On the announcement of the partnership, RFL chairman Simon Johnson said, "In the recent years, an immense amount of work has gone on in initially protecting the sport throughout the pandemic, but also setting it on a course for real growth. The governance realignment was key and a prerequisite to attracting a partnership such as this. IMG is a global giant in the sports and entertainment industry, and this alliance is fantastically exciting for our future." Super League chairman Ken Davey added that, "We consulted widely on the strategic partner to find someone who brought into our vision for the Super League competition and the sport of rugby league as a whole. In IMG, we have a world-renowned partner that has all the requisite strengths to ensure the sport's continued growth and development." So it appeared that rugby league was going to reunite once again, with IMG serving as an expensive mediator and also being tasked with coming up a set of recommendations on how the game of rugby can better market and present itself. And on 28th of September 2022, IMG announced their recommendations in a proposal entitled Reimagining Rugby League. The plans were laid out in front of the representatives of the Super League and RFL member clubs and stated that IMG's recommendations have the overriding aim of driving the long-term value and impact of the sport. IMG recommended a realignment of the sports calendar, an expansion plan and a new branding and commercial strategy, but there was one recommendation that stood out amongst the rest. IMG recommended that participation in the top tier to be based on a range of on- and off-field measures, delivered through a club grading system with the aim of supporting financial sustainability and encouraging investment into clubs. Category A clubs will be guaranteed participation in the top tier, whilst Category B clubs will be reassessed annually, with the highest ranking clubs occupying the remaining slots in the top tier. Promotion and relegation will continue on the field of play between second and third tiers, with Tier 2 increasingly filled with strong Category B clubs. The recommendations seemed awfully familiar to some. IMG, like their predecessors, seemed to be pointing the finger at the clubs outside of the Super League. Under their recommendations, clubs would once again be categorised based on off-field criteria, and would need to meet certain criteria in order to attain promotion to the Super League. But most shockingly, for the first time in the history of the sport, a club assessed as Category A would now be exempt and protected from relegation. On October the 13th, just 2 weeks after the initial announcement, the club representatives once again met and approved the proposals, with 37 voting in favour out of 42 clubs. Only Keighley Cougars voted against the proposals, and Batley and Dewsbury abstained, stating that there was insufficient information provided for a decision to be made. The 2 other missing votes remain unaccounted for at this time. Cowie Garcia, the representative of Keighley Cougars, was the only attendee to vote against the proposal. Keighley have history when it comes to exclusionary decisions that seem to halt their progression, and Cowie's father-in-law, Mick O'Neill, was in exactly the same situation as Cowie 27 years ago, when the first attempt to handpick clubs for Super League was made. After the vote, Chief Executive of Keighley Cougars, Ryan O'Neill, stated that to give elite clubs immunity from relegation runs contrary to our values. To create a top division with elite clubs who could never face relegation is only in the self-interests of those involved. It is unfair, it is anti-competition, and it isn't sport. The Cougars are currently standing alone against these proposals, but we believe in our values and in the long-term interests of our sport. This vote was in favour of the equivalent of the failed European Super League in football. Keighley's MP Robbie Moore also backed the club's view, stating that the Rugby Football League and IMG should not be an elitist venture where clubs can pay in to win, with immunity from relegation. It's not fair and it's not sport. The views from Keighley Cougars were backed by many supporters across Rugby League, but also saw the club and its owners attacked. The criticisms mainly revolved around the club complaining, stating Keighley's stature in the game meant that they should have minimal input in any decisions made or not have an opinion at all, and that the proposals were equitable to all clubs in Rugby League as criteria would be across the board. But it is important to not only analyse the potential impacts of the recommendations from IMG, but also to understand how they fit alongside the history of the sport of Rugby League itself. Much like the inception of Super League in 1995 and the introduction of licensing, will these changes actually do anything to fix the issues facing Rugby League? One fact that is unarguable is that IMG is an extremely successful marketing company with a strong network of contacts within all forms of media and entertainment. The decision by the RFL and Super League to link in with IMG is a logical one, and it's one that's going to undoubtedly open a lot of doors for Rugby League. IMG has the ability to provide the sport with the expertise in marketing, branding and commercial activities that it badly needs. Within the proposals laid out by IMG, there are a number of points of issue that are areas in which Rugby League has been trying to solve since its inception. The areas of expansion, the international calendar, branding, marketing, and increasing the amount of people actually playing the game are all elements that IMG could very well come up with a viable solution for. So why are the proposals so controversial? The proposals would probably be universally accepted if it was not for the suggestion of returning to a semi-franchise model of running the Super League, and protecting those categorised as Category A, or elite clubs as they've been referred to, from relegation. To understand why IMG's proposal to use a ranking system to decide on the participants in the league has been so controversial within some Rugby League circles, we need to remember how Rugby League was formed. At the start of this video, we explored 3 of Rugby League's main issues, and the fact that they were all born out of the split from Union in 1895. The resentment and negative stereotyping of this northern sport made it difficult to expand outside of its traditional heartlands, in both the sense of playing and watching the game. The media portrayal of Rugby League as a northern sport also made investment into the game less lucrative, and when that investment happened, it came from mainly northern or working class brands. The habitual lack of money in Rugby League has been an issue for generations, and it means that lucrative offers into the sport, such as football clubs buying expansion sides in the 1980s and B-Sky-B effectively buying the sport in the 90s, have been accepted without any real consideration of the consequences. The split in 1895 did not just create a new code of rugby football, it created a fiercely loyal and traditional sport with a set of founding principles that have been forever ingrained within the game. Rugby League was founded on these principles of fairness, equality, and sporting integrity. This has meant that occurrences such as the formation of Super League, introduction of licensing, and now the IMG proposals have been viewed by some as attacking the very principles of the sport. Which has meant that the formation of Super League, licensing, and this current proposal from IMG have become controversial because they are considered by many as not being fair, equal, or maintaining the integrity of the sporting competition. And here is why. The IMG plans propose a return to selective progression. Ranking all of the clubs in Rugby League and placing them into categories is itself a divisive act. It is literally creating divisions within the sport of A, B, or C, and then placing those into a hierarchy based on criteria that is not solely on the on-field performance of the team. Using this hierarchy to decide who will then take part in Super League, and with that have access to all the rewards it offers, creates a potential issue of fairness. Is it fair that a Category C club that wins the championship should be denied any further progression opportunities if 12 clubs currently rank higher than them in the hierarchy? Similarly, is it fair that a Category B club could leapfrog that same team and take any spare place within the Super League? Although these are being put forward as theoretical, they are events that have actually happened during the formation of Super League and the licensing period. And despite being devastating for the clubs involved, it can be argued that in hindsight, their exclusion from Super League has done nothing to strengthen the competition. The argument that small clubs are bringing down the sport has prevailed for decades, and has been presented at such key moments as the creation of Super League, the introduction of licensing, and it has once again become a key talking point in rugby. When assessing the credence to the argument, the key piece of evidence needs to be in whether any of the key issues of rugby league have ever been solved or even improved in periods when the top tier has isolated itself from the rest of the game, and those smaller clubs. To this date, there's been no instances of that occurring. Protecting the elite from relegation. So IMG's recommendations are also controversial because they propose protecting the clubs assigned as Category A from ever being relegated. It isn't hard to see why this is something that some rugby league supporters would find it hard to get behind. It also seems a strange proposal, as surely the elite clubs would be good enough to not find themselves to ever be in a position to be relegated. Again, this attacks the founding principles of fairness, equality, and sporting integrity. The main reason for protecting Category A clubs against relegation is that they are more important to the game and to the brand of Super League than the other clubs. For the clubs themselves, IMG and Super League, losing an elite club to relegation would be devastating. St Helens chairman Eamon McManus was quoted by the BBC after the vote on the 13th of October as saying, "Clubs are ruined when they are relegated, and we have got to look at our sport. In Rugby League, over the last 8 years, 7 of the 8 teams that have been promoted have been immediately relegated." The yo-yoing of clubs between the top tier and the second tier of Rugby League has been an issue for decades. And once again, the sport has not been able to solve this problem or the overall question of how do we structure our competitions. One thing to consider when looking at the issue is why is relegation so devastating? To put it simply, it's because the second and third tier are miles behind that of Super League in every metric measurable. To understand why this is, it is important to look at how the sport itself has viewed the second and third tier of its league structure. Since the creation of Super League in 1995, all leagues below it have operated with lesser importance than that of the first tier. The licensing period effectively cut off the Super League from the rest of the Rugby Football League in their own franchise system for 6 years, with Leigh the only non-licensed club from that time to make it to the Super League since. The RFL and Super League have effectively been portraying clubs and competitions below Super League as inferior brands of the sport. The result of this has been a loss in brand value of the clubs and competitions outside of Super League, and this has led to minimal to no television and media coverage for those clubs and competitions, fewer opportunities for investment, and a significantly smaller turnover for those clubs. This could explain why McManus would be scared to death of ever being relegated to the Championship. But whilst relegation has ruined clubs have also been ruined by being denied promotions that they have earned. Keighley and Batley suffered financial difficulties following their exclusion from Super League in 1995. Hunslet and Dewsbury have never reached the same heights since their title wins in 1999 and 2000, and Barrow, although not eligible for promotion at the time due to licensing, were relegated just 2 years after winning the championship in 2009. Due to the vast gulf between the Super League and the rest of the Rugby Football League, there is also the question of how fair it is to apply the same criteria to all of the clubs. So therefore it's important to look at the equitable application of the criteria. What the criteria consists of has currently not been revealed. However, after decades of being separated and excluded from the top table, it will most certainly be a difficult task for clubs currently outside of the Super League to gain entry. The question would be, how is it fairly applied? What it means is that clubs will now be in direct competition with each other, both on and off the field. It would mean that a Championship or League One side would need to ensure that their ground, facilities, commercial activities are better than the standard of the current Super League clubs, if they wanted to gain a place in Super League. As with events in the history of Rugby League, such as Framing the Future 2 and the licensing period, having an agreed set of criteria creates a baseline set of requirements for participation in the top league of the sport. But is it equitable to apply that to all clubs at the same time from the start? The RFL recently stripped a number of clubs of their academy systems and barred them from running a reserve side. So if academies, reserve teams, are part of this new criteria for assessment, then some clubs will have been unfairly held back from the start due to no fault of their own. The clubs that have been separated from and never been a part of Super League for decades will also need to bring themselves up to the standard of a club that has got adequate media coverage, years of financial, marketing and commercial benefit from their Super League membership before they will have the opportunity to join the league. Although it may appear equitable to start everybody off on the same playing field, having weighted criteria between the divisions would be a much fairer proposal. It would be a fair proposal due to the years of neglect that has been suffered outside of Super League. But this is just one of the problems when the decision of who deserves to be in a sporting competition is decided in a meeting room rather than on the field of play. So if these proposals are what Rugby League decides to do, and they decide that it is reimagining Rugby League, then what does history tell us are the chances of it being successful? The two previous attempts to implement a criteria system and introduce a selective system of progression to Rugby League's top flight have not worked. The attempt in 1995 to replace traditional clubs from the M62 corridor with clubs in Paris and London did not solve any of the problems faced by Rugby League. Super League closing itself off from the likes of Dewsbury and Hunslet did not solve any of the problems faced by Rugby League. Licensing, which was the most serious attempt to move towards an NRL-style franchise system, was also abandoned due to the common realisation that it simply did not work and did not solve any of the problems faced by Rugby League. IMG's recommendations are moving back to a system where the participants who make up the Super League are decided via a ranking system that is not a league competition. This is not a new idea. It is one that is controversial and difficult to get behind for many Rugby League supporters, as it goes against all of the founding principles of the game, and it has also been a method that has been proven to have not fixed any of the key problems Rugby League has had. It is arguable that with any sport there does need to be a minimum set of standards for clubs participating in the top tiers, in order to protect the integrity of that competition. The key question, though, is how those standards are enforced. How will Rugby League be able to create a Super League standard club without that club ever having benefits that the Super League provides? This is where the application of weighted criteria that is applied over a number of seasons after reaching the Super League would be effective. Effectively reaching the desired standard in small increments each season. But the suggestion in the recommendations is that that will be allowed for, with the championship increasingly becoming filled with strong Category B sides. The issue here, though, is that historically that has not been true if Super League is cut off from the rest of the tiers. In the licensing period, no Super League side was ever replaced by a Tier 2 club for not meeting the criteria required to get a licence. But there were Tier 2 sides that were refused entry based on that criteria. There needs to be movement between the tiers to ensure that clubs can maintain their ambition to improve on and off the field. So whatever is decided, it is imperative that IMG allow for this to happen. But once again, Rugby League is seemingly falling into the same trap of previous failed attempts to save the game. Once again, the sport is undergoing an exercise which will classify some of their own clubs as lesser brands of the game. The Category A clubs that are protected from relegation will undoubtedly come out of this whole exercise better than the clubs that are ranked Category B or C. As an outside investor looking to invest money into the sport, a club classified as Category A will provide a much better investment prospect than a Category B or C club. It is entirely possible that the second tier championship will be initially filled with Category B and C teams, if you look at the wording used in IMG's proposal. This would straight away mean that a Category C club in the championship would be an incredibly less exciting investment than a Category B club in the same division, as the Category C club would not be able to gain a place in Super League without first being reclassified as Category B. Another potential issue for investors looking at Category B or C clubs is that investing in one of these clubs would have an unknown return, as there are way too many variables which result in either not being selected for Super League or losing their place in that league. What this all means is, in essence, the status quo will be preserved. The already successful Category A clubs will get the lion's share of the investment. Then there will be the less attractive Category B clubs who will have some investment, and then whatever's left will trickle down to the remaining Category C clubs. But as of now, it's unknown what clubs will fit into what category. And prior to a set of criteria being released by IMG, Super League or the RFL, supporters have already started to argue about what category a club should be ranked. The assumptions of what category a club might be awarded have led to intense support or opposition to the IMG proposals. The absence of published criteria makes taking a viewpoint on the IMG proposals based on an assumed category that your club will get a risky call. There were supporters of the Super League and licensing who soon found themselves trapped outside of the top tier. This is why the decision to implement these proposals need to be made on their impact to the game as a whole and not just on their impact to clubs themselves. But much like the events that led us to this point, the decision on whether Rugby League will go forward with these proposals lies in the hands of the clubs. And if history has taught us anything, it will be that the clubs will vote in their own interests instead of that of the sport as a whole. Super League is the attractive, modern-looking penthouse at the top of the block of flats where everybody wants to get to. But unfortunately, that block of flats underneath it is crumbling. The occupants of the penthouse are shouting out the window about how terrible the foundations are and that everything's going to come crashing down. But everybody just keeps adding new furniture or a new coat of paint to the penthouse while new occupants move in, and nobody really addresses the problem of the crumbling building that sits below it. But the main issue that nobody seems to want to address is that if those foundations collapse, then the penthouse will come down with it. So instead of somebody in the penthouse being scared to death of being evicted and having to move to one of the crumbling flats below them, perhaps it would be a better use of time and money to work on improving the flats that sit below the penthouse. Shore up those foundations that ending up in one of those flats wouldn't be so bad. And that there's significant investment in that structure that sits below to make it as strong as it can be once again. Or just knock it all down and build some American-style condos.